My name is Georg Blochmann. Most of you know me because we are the translation family, and we meet annually. That means every time we meet, we know we are 1 year older, and we all read dozens of new books throughout this year in whatever language. We widened our horizon with local literature and literature from abroad, and that's what this evening is about. Translation as a bridge to connect different cultures, different countries, different mindsets. Translators are those who are building these bridges, and that's why we are proud to present these prizes every year for people, for translators who did an exceptional work, young translators and older translators, established translators, excuse me. Sorry, established translators. I think this year is a year that I'm more than glad to be here on this podium and to moderate this awarding ceremony. We get to that point later on. We have 2 prizes to present, as I always consider this evening like a festive dinner, we just passed what the French call amuse-gueule, and we are going to the appetizer right now. The appetizer is the Gutekunst Prize of the Friends of Goethe, New York, which is awarded to a young translator who has never published any translation and who is doing their first step into the translation world. So there is a jury which picks the right one from all those one who apply. So this is it's on me to say thank you to the jury who read a lot of texts in the last month. Jeremy Davis, Alta L. Price, and Tess Lewis, to whom I will now give the microphone to talk about the results of their jury sessions. I don't like the lectern, but most people do. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you all for coming this evening to celebrate translators' translation in German literature. Thank you especially to Georg Blochmann and the Goethe-Institut for supporting the Gutekunst Prize, which by now has a quite impressive and proven track record. It's one of the very few prizes, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, that recognizes and supports emerging translators. And for that, we're very grateful. And finally, a special thank you to Walter Schlecht, without whose savoir-faire and logistical genius, things would be much bumpier. So thank you, Walter. There's been much talk recently, at least in translation circles, of how urgently we need translation in these dark times, of its central role in building understanding, empathy, indeed in safeguarding our very humanity. Civilization as we know it is doomed without translation. This is true, absolutely and utterly true, but tonight I'd like to talk about the intimate side of translation. I don't think many will object when I say that most of the time, intimacy takes precedence on a day-to-day basis in lived life over politics, although that balance seems to be shifting more and more these days. The personal is political, yes, but the intimate, well, that is political, it's apolitical, it's anti-political, it's uber-political, it's also quite simply intimate. It's exhilarating and embarrassing, it's inspiring and demoralizing, it's ecstatic and excruciating. And this, my friends, even though I don't need to tell you, all of this is translation as well. Language is voluptuary and ascetic, it's sensualist and moralist, it luxuriates in grammatical rules and in defying them. All of which brings me to Erin Palombi, this year's Gutekunst Prize winner. I don't mean to suggest that she's a voluptuary, a sensualist, or a linguistic rebel. Who am I to judge? I've never met her. Well, factually, I am a judge, and so I will. And I'm backed up by two exacting and discerning judges, Alta Price and Jeremy Davies, who fortunately couldn't be here. And we three were unanimous in finding her entry to be the best of a strong group. And therefore, the jury of the 2019 Gutekunst Prize commends Erin Palombi for her engaging, confident translation of the excerpt from Jana Hensel's novel Keinland. No Land is the story of a love that falters under the burden of history and geography, of individual and collective guilt, of strong passion and innate reserve. Indeed, the novel tracks the constant negotiation of two people living lives highly charged in both the intimate and the political spheres. The novel's narrator, Nadja, has been abandoned by her lover, Martin. She was born in the former East Germany, and he, the son of Holocaust survivors, was born in West Germany before emigrating to Israel as an adult. At first, the distances between the two, emotional, cultural, and geographic, seemed no match for their intense affection. They ignore the fault lines that appear early on in their relationship, and by the time they're yawning open, it's too late. Erin deftly conveys the shifting tones in Nadja's voice, her swings between optimism and pragmatism, between nostalgia and despair. At one point, Nadja recalls, "Let's found a new country," I said to Martin. I wanted to say to Martin, a small, slender, nearly invisible country. We have to found a country. Our country, please, with a table and two chairs, a bed and a closet. We don't need anything more. We have each other. Her eventual realization and acceptance that there is no land where their love could have flourished unconstrained is hard-won. Erin's translation is particularly attuned to the fits and starts of Nadja's obsessive ruminations on the source of the relationship's demise. She says, Nadja says, we'd spent half the night sitting at the kitchen table arguing about Munich, about the man with the mustache, about everything, about nothing, about our nothingness, not a bit abstract, completely concrete, your nothingness. It all started with the man with the mustache. No, it all ended with the man with the mustache. The end had begun, probably. The jury singled out Erin's entry for her fluid rendering of both internal monologue and dialogue, and her finely tuned ear for modulations in mood and tone. So, Erin, we're delighted to award you the 2019 Goethe-Kunst Prize and wish you many years of rewarding translation. Thank you.
Now it's up to me again, and I'm changing my functions immediately, and I'm switching to being the treasurer of the Friends of Goethe in New York. No longer the director of this institute. This is the Gutekunst Prize of the Friends of Goethe in New York. The Gutekunst Prize was inaugurated by a generous donation of the descendants of a professor of German language who donated a serious amount of money some 10 years ago, and of course on a certain point the money was spent as we were able to award this prize every year, and so the Friends of Goethe in New York, who support our activities and especially support the cultural exchange between America and Germany, took over the funding of this prize. I have to give you the greetings of our chairperson, Lia Pfeiffer-Friedrich, who is facing a serious surgery, so she can't come. So this is the the 2019 Gutekunst Prize of the Friends of Goethe, of the Friends of Goethe New York, which is awarded to Erin Palombi, and this is a prize. No. No. This is yours.
Thank you.
This is yours, and this is yours as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So now I hand it over to her. We are proud. We are proud to have you here. Thanks for coming here, and thank you for this wonderful translation. And we wish you good luck for your future career as a translator. If you take this as a motivation to become one. Now we need some photo. Yeah, we're looking into the camera. Yeah. Okay. So, okay. Now I think you want to read something. Yeah. So I leave the podium to you, and we are curious what we are going to hear right now.
Thank you.
This is yours, or this is yours.
And I'm guessing I'll need to lower this. Okay. All right. Good evening, and thank you so much for having me. Still too high. All right. First of all, I'd like to say thank you so much to the jury and the Goethe-Institut, everyone involved in the prize. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight. Translation, obviously, is not my day job. I'm a film archivist at the Library of Congress in Virginia, and so it's actually a thrill for once to put my German degree to use. And it's especially an honor to be recognized for something that I've been so personally invested in for such a long time. So thank you very much. As for the book, in reading Keinland, Jana Hensel drew me in immediately with her repetitive, self-referential language. I felt more and more involved in the story each time I recognized a turn of phrase from a previous page or relived an event that had been related in an earlier chapter. Hensel uses this repetition of words, phrasing, and entire scenes to impart an all-important underlying sense of obsession. Obsession with love, obsession with guilt, and above all, obsession with the past. When translating these instances in particular, I focused on maintaining this sense of recurrence by staying as true to her syntax and word choice as I could. When I found myself needing to veer away from the original, I prioritized consistency. And actually, to better illustrate these characteristics, I've chosen a brief excerpt from the text itself. I'll be reading just a few pages from the first chapter, entitled Hideouts. And in it, we'll hear Nadia, the narrator. She's on a bike ride through Berlin the morning that she discovers her lover, Martin, has left her. You stayed with me for longer than you wanted to. Much longer, for that matter, nearly an entire year. In fact, you wanted to leave immediately. Will you come back to me, Martin? No, you say. Yes, I say. It's always been this way, from our first evening on the beach in Tel Aviv to this morning. That evening, I wore the short black silk skirt and 2 high heels. You always said no, and I always answered you with yes. Love will be enough, I thought. Love is always enough, I said, as I waited for the next day. I had undoubtedly learned that from the movies. Love stories, of course, with happy endings, naturally. I had believed my life could be like a movie, too. But love isn't always enough. Would I finally understand that now? That all my waiting wouldn't be enough, just as my love hadn't been enough? Understand what really happened, I mean. I know that Martin thinks no one will ever understand what happened to his people. What's still happening to him will continue to happen from this day forward. Is that why you hate most people so much, Martin? What gives you that impression, Nadia? I don't care about most people. None of them is my concern. You were my only concern. You aren't like them. We often spoke this way. Yes, no, yes, no, yes. My land, your land, no land. Our land, perhaps. Slightly more than nothing at all. On the phone, in the car, in hotel rooms, on the beach, in bed. In Berlin, in Tel Aviv, in Munich, in Jerusalem, in every city in the world. To someone who didn't know us, it must have seemed like we hardly ever agreed on anything, as if we were constantly getting our wires crossed. We often did get our wires crossed. Yes, no, yes, no, yes. But that's not the case. It really isn't. We both believed that love would be enough, to each his own. With love, we could come to grips with what was, the fact that my people sent his people to their deaths. Children, women, men, the elderly. Children, women, men, the elderly. Children, women, men, the elderly. Over and over again. More and more and more and more. It really wasn't so long ago. Until there were to be no more. Until he might never have existed. Until I might never have been able to meet someone like him. We never should have met. But in the end, I had to admit that he was right. Love isn't enough. It wasn't enough for us. I have to wrap my head around that once and for all. Why he couldn't stay, but stayed anyway. Why I waited for him until this morning. Always. I leave the Soho house behind me and ride past the Volksbühne. I always think of Betty here, because Betty worked as a set designer at the Volksbühne. Back then, we saw practically every production together and collected the little playbills as if they were individual chapters of a journal. It's not far from here to the Spree River. I continue along Rosa-Luxemburg-Straße, then briefly down Münzstraße, and finally Rochstraße, where I ride behind the Plattenbaus on Alexanderplatz and nearly as far as Hackischer Markt. I like these prefab apartment buildings, and actually always have. To me, they gleam despite their looming modesty. They aren't showy. Maybe that's why so many people dislike them. But in a way that's hard to describe, these post-war structures are honest buildings, and isn't ugliness invariably bound up with the truth? I have to stop at the bridge in front of the Alte Nationalgalerie, a bridge whose name I can never seem to remember, a bridge whose name I don't think anyone actually knows. A crowd has formed and is blocking my path, which is fine by me. In the middle of the bridge, what looks to be a Turkish couple is set up to be photographed on 2 empty fruit crates, and in such a way that the Spree is clearly visible behind them. Looks bigger than it is. The photographer has laid the long white veil across the bridge, and a Japanese tour group wants to take pictures of the couple too. There's something funny about how busy it all looks, but I don't feel like laughing. I stand there with my bike and wonder how many pictures these tourists will go home with. Pictures of the wall, the Brandenburg Gate, the TV tower. No, probably none of the TV tower. Of Angela Merkel at Madame Tussauds, of the Holocaust Memorial, and now these of the Turkish bridal couple on the empty fruit crates. They must think, as I do, that these pictures could represent our country. They must think, as I do, that these pictures could represent us. Thank you so much.
is a highly acclaimed cellist, specialized in contemporary music. He is a co-founder of the Thaler Ensemble, one of the most important New York-based contemporary music ensembles, which has just been celebrating its 10th anniversary, and they and Christopher on his own played all over the world. Thank you for this highly virtuosic piece by Lachenmann. With Lachenmann, we meet just the other side of post-war composition techniques, just the other side of American minimalism. It was composed at the same time, and that brings us to the point. We conceived our musical program in accordance to the book that the book and the translation we are celebrating today. The translation of Anniversaries of Uwe Jonsson, which is situated here in New York in the late 60s. So this, what we hear tonight, is a soundtrack of Uwe Jonsson. It's a soundtrack of Gesine Crespal. I don't know whether they really heard it. Damion knows better whether it was always whether it was ever mentioned in the text. I think it was not. But it's a time of extremities on all sides, as music is expanding to all directions, like we heard in the first two pieces. This is an introduction to what again the French call pièce de résistance, the main course, which is our 24th annual Helen and Kurt Wolff Translator Prize, which we will be awarding tonight for work that a lot of people don't find too long to read, and because it's 1,600 pages, but there are heroes who even translate it. Within one lifetime. I don't want to say more about that. I have to say thank you to the jury of the prize who read a lot of books. You will hear about this later. To Bettina Abravanel, Ross Benjamin, John Hargrave, Susan Harris, and the chair of the jury, Shelley Frisch, to whom I will now give the microphone. Shelley, please.
It's wonderful to be celebrating this again. I think I'm a little bit taller. And I would like to start by reading the jury statement that you may have seen on the website for the Helen and Kurt Wolff Prize, which we wrote after naming this book our winner for 2019. The jury for the Helen and Kurt Wolff Translators Prize takes great pleasure in awarding this year's prize to Damion Searls for his masterful translation of Uwe Jonsson's Anniversaries. This multi-volume novel, which poses daunting translation challenges, chronicles a year, August 1967 to August 1968, in the life of Gesine Crespal, a woman who left her small town in East Germany for New York's Upper West Side with her young daughter, and overlays her daily struggles with painful memories of the past and the alarming news of the present world in a daily recorded, year-long montage. Searles's translation of this monumental work, which has been compared to the writings of Joyce, Faulkner, and Balzac, is the first complete edition of this novel in English. His sparkling translation, thank goodness because it's so long, captures the dizzying swirl of events from the quotidian to the earth-shattering with meticulous, acoustically spellbinding prose, and makes for riveting reading throughout its nearly 1,700 pages. Now back to my other hat. That was the jury chair hat. Now I'd like to talk about this book and what a marvel it is. I wanted to start, though, by congratulating Erin on the Gutekunst Prize, which is a lovely and well-deserved prize. Congratulations to Damion Searls, for reasons I'll detail in a moment, and to his editor, who is here tonight, Edwin Frank, for taking on the challenge of publishing this work, which stands out among New York Review of Books classics publications for reasons that include its need for a slipcase to hold it together. I gather it's the only New York Review of Books book that has ever had this unique position of meriting its own slipcase. This book has such a vast panoramic scope and length, no way could I summarize its many virtues adequately. So I figured perhaps I'll just read the novel aloud, first in German, then in English, because I figured that, and here it comes, I didn't want to be like our current Attorney General who gives you a redacted version. I hope your seats are very comfortable because we're starting with Volume 1, Page 1. Let's see now. I'll put these away for the moment. Here we go, Volume 1, Page 1. But I also Xeroxed it just to make sure I was in the right place. I'll read from the Xerox thing. Okay, not a very long Xerox. Okay. Lange Wellen treiben schräg gegen den Strand, wölben Buckel mit Muskelsträngen, heben zitternde Kämme, die im grünsten Stand kippen. Der straffe Überschlag, schon weißlich gestriemt, umwickelt einen runden Hohlraum Luft, der von der klaren Masse zerdrückt wird, als sei da ein Geheimnis gemacht und zerstört worden. Die zerplatzende Woge stößt Kinder von den Füßen, wirbelt sie rundum, zerrt sie flach über den graubligen Grund. Jenseits der Brandung ziehen die Wellen, die Schwimmende an ausgestreckten Händen über ihren Rücken. Der Wind ist flatterig. Bei solchem drucklosen Wind ist die Ostsee in ein Plätschern ausgelaufen. Das Wort für die kurzen Wellen der Ostsee ist kabbelig gewesen. Lucky you, I'm stopping after one paragraph. And I will now read the first paragraph only of the English translation of Damion's wonderful translation. Just wanted to scare you for a second there, but also encourage you to read more than the first paragraph. Here we go. Long waves beat diagonally against the beach, bulge hunchbacked with cords of muscle, raise quivering ridges that tip over at the very greenest. Crests stretched tight, already welted white, wrap round a cavity of air crushed by the clear mass like a secret made and then broken. The crashing swells knock children off their feet, spin them round, drag them flat across the pebbly ground. Past the breakers, the waves pull the swimmer across their backs by her outstretched hands. The wind is fluttery. In low-pressure wind like this, the Baltic Sea used to peter out into a burble. The word for the short waves on the Baltic was scrabbly. When I told Damion, on the telephone I believe it was, how much I admired his inventive language, he went straight for a word in that very passage that I just read to you, saying, "You mean words like scrabbly?" Kabbelig in the German. I replied, yes, scrabbly is a really good word, but wonderfully evocative, but my sense of wonder comes from how individual words, comes less from individual words than how they fit together. Their sounds and cadences, those colossal consonantal combos, those vibrant vocalic volleys. I'm fond of quoting Toni Morrison's statement, and I think it applies to this book in particular. She was my neighbor a long time in Princeton. She wrote, you rely on a sentence to say more than the denotation and the connotation. You revel in the smoke that the words send up. There is fine smoke to be had in this translation. And now let's move on to the elephant in the room, the sheer length and scope of this work, and its weight. I recently had spinal surgery, and I'm not even allowed to lift it. But my surgeon couldn't prohibit me from enjoying it in the comfort of my aptly named stressless chair. I really do have a stressless chair. It is so named. I might add here that this is the first full translation of this novel. A greatly abridged one came out in 1987, I think it was, though I haven't read it. But I have read this one. Jonsson worked on the novel for a decade and a half, and when he completed it in 1983, he had about one more year to live. He died in the island town of Sheerness. One is tempted to seek significance in that name. The ostensible time span of the book is August 1967 to August 1968, during which Gesine Kaspar, the main character, records her daily impressions of life on Riverside Drive, the exact building Uwe Jonsson himself lived in, and a few short blocks, I gather, from where Damion Searls himself grew up, which confirms my impression that all translation is local, but that's a subject for another day. And Gesine Kaspar reflects on her own and her family's and country's past back in Europe, adjusts to life in New York, as does her daughter, Marie, and muses on current events in the US and abroad. So it's a little bit of everything. The New Yorker has compared the structure of this novel to a Möbius strip. Kirkus Reviews calls it a Joseph Cornell box in words. The novel's diary entry offers up a collage of impressions that blur the distinction between the personal experiences of its protagonist and a panoply of local and global social and political affairs. The Vietnam War looms large in these pages. The New York Times is actually a key player in the book, that Gesine even bestows a name on her, Tante Times, anti-Times in Damion's translation. Gesine reads the New York Times cover to cover every day after picking it up at her local Broadway newsstand and uses its news coverage as a springboard for many of her reflections. It's hard to decide on the book's finest aperçu, but one I enjoyed about the New York subway system is this. Even on the most crowded platforms, people move as though surrounded by a personal radar system, never touching the people next to them. It is so unusual to see someone running that when such a person does approach, a path opens up in the middle of the crowd. I like this image and many other observations about the subways, though as a native New Yorker myself, I was kind of hoping for Miss Subways to make an appearance. For those of you who grew up here, you may remember Miss Subways in all the subway cars. This reader was repeatedly startled to encounter names that continue to loom large in the current discourse, such as this one in Gesine's entry of October 28, 1967. John Sidney McCain III was shot down over Hanoi. He'd survived the fire on the USS Forrestal aircraft carrier in July after seeing and these are his words, what the bombs and napalm did to the people on our ship. I'm not so sure that I want to drop any more of that stuff on North Vietnam. That's the end of the quote. Well, that's the end of John McCain's quote. But he did it anyway, and now Radio Hanoi has reported his capture. That's the passage from the book. Another surprise for me was the appearance in the novel of Hannah Arendt, here called Countess Seidlitz. A little background, when Jonsson was in New York, his American publisher was Helen Wolff, the self-same Helen Wolff for which this prize is named. Turns out Helen Wolff got him a job at Harcourt Brace and World, and she introduced him to a whole host of movers and shakers in New York, including Hannah Arendt, who in turn introduced him to W.H. Auden, Susan Sontag, and other luminaries. Arendt wasn't entirely pleased with her Countess alter ego, but after the first volume of the 4 that came out in German, you just saw them, of the Anniversaries was published, she did claim that it was likely a masterpiece that, quote, made the recent German past tangible and convincing. Now I know how it was and is over there. Know it down to the tips of my toes. Several people named Johnson pop up in the text. There's a Wilbur Johnson, I did a word search, a Martha Johnson, and even a Howard Johnson's restaurant. President Johnson comes up fairly often, generally in the context of the Vietnam War. But there's also an appearance by one Uwe Jonsson. The novel's main character, Gesine Crespin, describes Jonsson's fraught and humiliating and real-life appearance before the American Jewish Committee in New York to discuss a political development in Germany. And I quote from Gesine's reflections on him leaving the auditorium, on Uwe Jonsson. At no point did they applaud him. After the event, he disappeared around the corner of Madison Avenue onto 45th Street in a hurry toward Grand Central, toward the subway. In future, he will keep his head down for as long as a government speaks in his name. That's the end of the quote. I'll stop here, otherwise I really will be sorely tempted to read you the whole novel, which The Guardian has called a novel of a year, perhaps the novel of the year. It is long, certainly, but let me assure you that lengthy as it is, this is a gripping read throughout. For this, too, I congratulate you, Damion Searls. Helen and Kurt Wolff would have been pleased to see you receive this honor in their name. Congratulations.
To put the books away because the award is here too. Thank you so much for this really inspiring laudation, and I fear my speech will be with much less esprit. So, distinguished guests, members of the jury, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great privilege for me to speak to you tonight on this special occasion, and I would like to extend a heartfelt welcome to you, and in particular our awardee, Mr. Damion Searls, and his editor, Mr. Edwin Frank. Hello. Allow me to also extend my sincere appreciation to the representatives of our hosting organization, the Goethe-Institut, and in particular Georg Blochmann, for administering and also supporting the Helen and Kurt Wolff Translator Prize. The prize is awarded once a year for an outstanding literary translation from German into English, published in the USA in the previous year. I have the privilege to present this year's Helen and Kurt Wolff Prize to Daymond Searles for his accomplishment of a masterful translation of Uwe Jonsson's Anniversaries from a year in the life of Gesine Crespin. Daymond Searles, who grew up in New York, studied German philosophy at Harvard University and American literature at Berkeley, is an award-winning writer and translator from German, Norwegian, French, and Dutch. He has translated many illustrious modern classics such as Rainer Maria Rilke, Marcel Proust, Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Walser, Ingeborg Bachmann, Alfred Döblin, Jan Fosse, and Alfred Jelinek, many others. Ladies and gentlemen, we certainly all realize that a straightforward conversion of one language to the other simply would not work. Jacques Derrida once put it, in a sense, nothing is untranslatable, but in another sense, everything is untranslatable. It is easy for me always to hold firm between these two hyperboles, which are fundamentally the same and always translate each other. Literature is, in this sense, living culture. Books are written by individuals, but they are always influenced by that individual's society, its culture, and its mental frames. Works of literature are infused by a culture's values in that they often engage the culture in full depth. By translating literature into another language, and in this case into English, a language that is spoken almost everywhere in the world, we are able to explore these realms and take part in a unique discourse in worlds that are otherwise unknown to us. In his translation, Mr. Searles, however, not only masters the right words and expressions, he captures the author's mind, Uwe Jonsson's mind, and accompanies and guides him Like a friend, from one language to the other language. Without the commitment, the creativity, and the care of people like Mr. Searles, we would lack the access to these other authors' worlds and ideas, his words and expressions that they create these worlds. In nearly 700 pages, Mr. Searles gives us an insight into a dizzying world created by Uwe Jonsson in 1967, who set out to tell us the tale of Gesine Crespal, a 34-year-old single mother who is a German émigrée to Manhattan's Upper West Side, and her daughter Marie. A story told of work and school, of friends and lovers, and of countless small encounters with neighbors and strangers and other people that make up this big city's life, as well as the racial unrest roiling America and the escalating war in Vietnam. But also a story told by Gesine to her daughter Marie about her childhood in a small North German town, of her independent and enterprising father, of her troubled mother, and of Nazi Germany, the Second World War, and the experiences in grimly regulated realities of communist East Germany. To better describe the outstanding quality of Mr. Searles' translation of Anniversary into English, allow me to quote, and here I was so glad that you didn't quote it, from the New York Times, Mr. Searles, who says, Searles' superb translation inscribes Jonsson's restlessness and probing into word choice and the structures of the sentences themselves, which quiver with the anxiety to get things right, to see the world as it is. A masterpiece that requires your full attention and a lot of time to read. Mr. Searles, Damion Searles, I take great pleasure in presenting to you the 2019 Helen and Kurt Wolff Translators Prize. My heartfelt congratulations on this great award, and thank you for sharing with us the insights into these worlds and ideas. We very much look forward to more of it. Thank you. So, would you come? And yeah, please do. Thank you. Signed by the Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Federal Republic of Germany. I would like to present you this award. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And?
Congratulations.
Thank you.
We are so proud to have you here. We are so proud of this translation. I have never been so proud.
Let's see, this is, that's mine. On the, thanks. Well, thank you so much. I too would like to thank the jury, the Goethe-Institut, Edwin Frank, the publisher, the cover designer, the cellist, whoever picked the cellist. I don't know how you knew that cello is my favorite instrument, so thank you. That's been a real treat. I'm extremely honored to be getting the Helen and Kurt Wolff Prize for this particular book, which really is a book of a lifetime for, I think, most anyone who reads it, but it was certainly a book of a lifetime for me as a translator. I first came upon it and read it close to 25 years ago, which is almost halfway back from now to 1967-68. I had first heard of Uwe Jonsson as the author of a book about my favorite writer at the time, Ingeborg Bachmann, and then discovered that he had written this gigantic novel about my neighborhood where I grew up, as Shelley mentioned, 3 blocks away from Gesine Crespal's apartment. So the book means a lot to me for many of those personal reasons as well. I'm sure that Uwe Jonsson would have been thrilled to have his book receive a Helen and Kurt Wolff Prize, and feel equally safe in saying that Helen Wolff would be extremely happy that the prize she endowed went to this novel. As Shelley mentioned, they knew each other, but more than that, Helen Wolff was probably one of the single most important people who made this book possible. In fact, the book is dedicated to Peter Zoerkamp and Helen Wolff. Janssen came to New York, invited by the Goethe-Institut in 1965, along with another young star novelist named Günter Grass, who at the time was much more famous than him. And so Janssen, in his typical sort of defensive, aggressive way, when people asked him, "So who are you?" he'd say, "Oh, I'm Günter Grass's photographer." But it was on that 1965 trip that he met Helen Wolff. He was not happy with the publication by Grove Press of his first novel in English, Speculations About Jacob, and with how the second one was going. So she is an editor of, I don't think it was Harcourt Brace World yet, I think it was Houghton Mifflin Harcourt at the time. She got the second novel away from Grove, published a translation of the third novel as well, worked with him on revising the translation, and most importantly, got him a job in New York at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, working on a textbook for high school German language learners. So that's how he lived in New York at all for the first year he lived here, 1966 to 67. Then Wolff and Hannah Arendt got him a Rockefeller Fellowship, so he was able to stay a second year. Wolff talked to her boss at the publishers and got permission for Uwe Janssen to have an office. So as he later said, he would take the same commute, go to work, show up on time, close the door, and read the newspaper. But that was where he wrote the beginning of Anniversaries. Some of the things I've read even say that it was Helen Wolff who gave him the idea to stop writing about East Germany, West Germany, and instead write about East-West in the context of America, Europe. And that is really the core of the book. She introduced him to all sorts of people, not only the glittering literati we heard about, but she got him the opportunity to take a ride in a police squad car so he could see what that was like. She introduced him to bankers. She took him to a baseball game. She really was very central in his immersion into life in New York. As I say, not only did he dedicate the book to her, at the end of his life, after finishing the book, he said this in an interview that I think speaks to the importance she had for him and his project. He said in the interview, with the publication, I'm translating it, he said in German, with the publication, the delivery of the fourth volume, it feels like I've kept a promise I made. First, a promise to Gesine Crespal to finish the thing. Second, to Helen Wolff, who kept threatening that she would die before I finished it, but luckily I did manage to finish it. Third and most important, that I've kept a promise to the readers, he goes on. So that's the company he puts her in. The readers who are most important to the work of literature, and the character, this incredible character that he created, and Helen Wolff. Those were the people he wrote the book for. There's so much to say about Janssen in this book. Since it's a translator's prize, I thought I would say just one thing about translation. Unfortunately, I was going to talk about the first paragraph of the book, but I'll still talk about it a little. I still think there's a little something to say about it. I'm really especially moved that in awarding the Wolff Prize to this book, the jury talked about the acoustics of it. because that is so much what matters in a translation and so little what anyone ever talks about. Everyone talks about the accuracy or perhaps faithfulness, but the acoustic sound of it is what makes or breaks it, like anything else one reads. There's a line from Gertrude Stein that I actually think about a lot in this context, from an essay called Henry James that isn't really about Henry James. And she says, it's not clarity that's desirable, but force, which she also calls vitality. She says, clarity is of no importance because nobody listens and nobody knows what you mean, no matter what you mean or how clearly you mean what you mean. But if you have vitality enough to know enough about what you mean, then people will have to realize that you mean what you mean and agree that you mean what it is you know you mean. And that is as close to understanding anybody that anyone can ever reach. I'm misquoting slightly, but it's not about the clarity of a translation, except insofar as it's about the force of a translation. One review that did mention that a little bit in the context of Anniversaries was Mary Stewart in the TLS, who, because there is this earlier partial translation at her disposal to compare it to, it is a bit possible to talk about different sort of sonic qualities. So this review quoted the first sentence as translated in this earlier translation, and then the first sentence in mine. So I'm just going to say those two. You've heard mine just now, but you'll hear it again. So in the earlier translation, it said, long waves sweep slanting against the beach, hump-muscled backs raise trembling combs that tip over at the greenest summit. And then my version was, long waves beat diagonally against the beach, bulge hunchbacked with cords of muscle, raise quivering ridges that tip over at their very greenest. And what the reviewer said was, the unusual details are all there again, but their impact is the greater for a choice of wording that makes visual and oral sense. I only wish she had said a little more, because it's actually quite hard to know what that means, visual and oral sense. In actually translating it, you know, I think if I remember right, I translated this relatively quickly. It was the first paragraph of the book, so it was important. I looked at the earlier translation, but I just sort of went ahead and did it, with the exception of one word that I'll talk about in a second. And you know, I didn't go back and revise it that much. So what I'm going to say now that I'm trying to think, okay, what does make oral and visual sense, isn't what I was thinking as I was doing it, but I still think it's true. I think that it's hard to say the words hump-muscled backs. The U-M-P-M-U sound is really unpleasant if you try and say it. The hump-muscled backs, raised trembling combs is nice in the earlier translation. Raised trembling combs that tip over has the nice assonance with the combs and over. But the assonance is kind of in the wrong place. You don't want to land on over, you want to land on the tipping. So my version was bulge hunchbacked with cords of muscle, raise quivering ridges that tip over. So you get the quivering ridges tip and then it tips over. So you have to talk like that if you want to really get into what makes oral sense. In terms of the visual sense, you know, I think sweeping against a beach is different from beating against a beach. Sweeping is kind of staying on the surface and not really penetrating in, not hitting it, just sort of brushing it. So long waves sweep slanting against the beach isn't quite the same as beating diagonally against the beach. Diagonally, you know, it's too bad. German has this great word, schräg. One syllable, boom, it's like. And so slanting is 2 syllables, diagonally is 5, but even so, like a wave hitting the beach slanting just isn't quite there, you know, and the same with the greenest summit in the earlier translation, that they tip over at the greenest summit. I don't know, I can't quite picture the summit of a wave. I mean, waves don't have hunchbacks either, but that's an image you can see. And the greenest summit, that might be something of a mistake. In German, as you heard, it's tipping over im grünsten Stand. Stand meaning, it could mean sort of standing upness or level. It is a word for water level, but it's also a word for sort of condition or state. So at its very greenest kind of makes sense to me more than the greenest summit, because waves aren't green up the top. Anyway, one could go on like this if one wanted to truly sort of plumb the depths of what makes oral and visual sense. And again, this isn't what one does as a translator. I guarantee you, I did not think about any of this when I was translating it. But at the same time, it is kind of what goes into it. The one thing that really brought me up short was this last word for the short waves on the Baltic. In the earlier translation, Venevitz said the word for the short waves of the Baltic was choppity. Choppity. And I thought that's pretty good, you know. It's like a strange word, but I know what it means. It's like choppy. That's what I put in my draft, and then I moved on. In fact, the galleys of the book say choppity. And at some point near the end, actually once I had finished the book and was looking at the galleys, I thought, wait, that's wrong. It's not choppity. And I don't know what the criteria were for making this decision, because it's just a word that has the definition that he says it has. But this is what a translator really has to be doing. So choppity just suddenly seemed to me too Beatrix Potter, hippity-hoppity, bippity-boppity, like too English as opposed to American, or if you don't want to put it that way, to Beatrix Potter as opposed to like Emily Bronte, you know? And that was not what the energy of this Baltic memory was that is bursting into her experience as she's swimming in New Jersey. And that's why I went with scrabbly, which again isn't a word that I've ever heard applied to waves, but you sort of know what it means, and it just has a different energy, or as Gertrude Stein says, vitality about it. It's a different kind of experience. Just today, I decided when I was thinking about what to say tonight, that I would go to the OED and go to the German etymological dictionaries and start trying to figure out if I could reverse engineer a good reason for having picked this word. And sure enough, I could. Cobblig, of course, is sonically very similar to scrabbly, so that doesn't always mean anything, but German and English are pretty close, so it sometimes means something. There's also kabelei, or a verb form of kabeln, that means to sort of squabble or quarrel or kind of have a scrappy little argument. So the scrabbly, scrappy thing actually works well. Scrabble isn't an Americanism, but hard scrabble is. Scrabble has these different meanings of scribbling, like writing, scribble, scrabble, and then also, of course, scratching around or raking, which was sort of my sense of the word scrabble. Scrambling along, struggling or scrambling for something. And as I say, hardscrabble is an Americanism, so it does have this more, in a way, belligerent and confrontational, energetic vitality about it. And, you know, when I made that change from choppity to scrabbly, I kind of secretly believed that that changed the whole book. All 1,700 pages were different. I don't literally believe that, but secretly, I kind of mystically believe that the whole book is different because it's not choppity, it's scrabbly. I think that as my, you know, manifesto as a translator, instead of saying make it new, like Ezra Pound said, mine is make it scrabbly. Because it's not clarity that's desirable, but force. So I'm so grateful, not only for the prize, but for the extremely rare, sensitive recognition that that these almost ineffable sonic aspects are what matter in what we read and what we write and how we translate. So thank you so much. It's really a great honor. Thanks.
Thank you all for coming here. Thanks to the juries who provided us with these two wonderful awardees and to choose one of the books I really love from my earliest youth, from my earliest youth, and where I was waiting so desperately for the 4th volume to appear, to have it here entirely. Now. I give the stage again to Christopher Gross for the end of our musical journey. Brings us to Charles Vuorinen, another American composer, and to third path in contemporary music of the early 70s and of the 60s, music that is based very deeply in the early contemporary music of the 20th century in Schönberg and Webern, and which represents American serialism. It's a powerful work, and I think it's the right sound to finish this wonderful evening. Not to finish it completely, you are all invited to share some wine and some food with us afterward. But now, once again, Christopher Gross, thank you.